This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
And now, our feature presentation.
Hi friends, this is
Part 2
of the Complete Xenogears Reference Guide. As always, if you notice anything I forgot or got wrong, leave me a comment about it, and if I get enough of them, I'll make an addendum video and give you credit for whatever you found. Alright, enjoy the video. Shaitan and Ellie have a conversation, and it would appear Shaitan has some knowledge of where Ellie comes from. She tells him that the shepherds, Abel, have dominion over the lambs, and can do with them as they see fit. Abel was the second son of Adam and Eve, famously murdered by his brother Cain in the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis. Further, the Bible tells its readers explicitly that Abel was a shepherd. Ellie goes on to say that she was taught to look down on lambs when she attended the military academy called Jugend. Jugend is a German word, usually translated as youth. Its use here is most certainly meant to invoke the Hitler Youth, which in German is Hitlerjugend, a not-so-subtle hint that wherever she comes from is not a nice place. Shaitan thereafter tells Faye where that is, the sacred empire of Solaris. Solaris is a reference to the 1961 science fiction novel by Polish author Stanislaw Lem concerning a space station studying life on the titular planet. In 1972, the novel was adapted into an acclaimed film by Soviet director Andrei Tarkovsky. The name Solaris gives the impression that the place is some sort of space station, or at least located somewhere in orbit. Faye and Shaitan emerge from the forest, and, in order to get more information and repair Veltal, travel to the desert city of Dazil. I wasn't able to attach any significant meaning to the name Dazil itself, but the atmosphere of the city seems to be another reference to Star Wars, specifically the city of Mos Eisley. In fact, this entire scene contains echoes of Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi's sojourn to Mos Eisley in the beginning of A New Hope. The novice hero, who's never seen the world beyond the boundaries of his village, travels with his world-seasoned mentor to a dangerous desert town. The similarities are enhanced if one considers the enemies around Dazil. One of them looks very similar to Star Wars' Tusken Raiders. While wandering around Dazil, the two men run into a rather eccentric figure named Big Joe, full name Joe Balboa. Balboa is a reference to Rocky Balboa, hero of the legendary 70s boxing movie franchise, and it's appropriate given that he looks somewhat similar to Sylvester Stallone. However, it should be noted that in Japanese, his name is not Joe Balboa, but Joe Rikishi. This references Joe Yabuki and Toru Rikishi, major characters in Tetsuya Chiba and Iki Kajiwara's genre-defining boxing manga Ashita no Joe. It would appear that translator Richard Honeywood was able to catch the reference, and correctly deducing that most English speakers probably wouldn't recognize the names of characters from a decades-old sports manga that's never been officially translated to English, decided to change his name to the most famous fictional boxer in the English-speaking world. Eventually, Shaitan rents a sand buggy to search for spare parts alone. Faye, warned about the dangers of traveling alone in the desert, goes out to look for him. During his search, he sees, high in the sky, what appears to be a flying saucer. This is jumping ahead slightly, but we eventually learn that the name of this UFO is Shevat, yet another reference to the Jewish calendar, this time to the 11th month, which closely corresponds to around January and February. Before we can find Shaitan, Faye is cornered by a terrifying masked man riding the same gear that led the assault on Lahan. This is Grahf, one of Xenogears' primary antagonists. The name Grahf is a reference to the German word Graf, a title of nobility that's usually translated into English as Count. His character is another Star Wars reference, this time to Darth Vader. Takahashi straight up admits this in Perfect Works, but even without that admission, the parallels are easy to spot. An evil guy in a mask and cape, the master of some vague mystical power, some sort of connection with the hero's father. Hell, even his theme song, Grahf, Emperor of Darkness, seems to echo the melody of the Imperial March. One more thing about Grahf before we move on. Specifically his gear's signature folded arms pose. The trope of a giant robot folding its arms to look badass is something that actually dates back nearly to the beginning of modern giant robot anime and manga as we know them. Ken Ishikawa was the first to utilize it in this iconic panel from the Jerico manga. This was later referenced by Gainax in their 1988 masterpiece Gunbuster. This scene of the Gunbuster emerging from the space battleship Excellion has been ingrained in mecha fandom ever since, and that pose, though technically preceding Gunbuster by over a decade, has come to be known to fandom as the Gainax pose. Given his predilections, Takahashi could be referencing either, but since Getter-Robo and Gunbuster are heroic figures and Grahf absolutely is not, a more likely source is probably G Gundam again, specifically the Master Gundam, which is piloted by a similarly menacing figure in Master Asia who follows the protagonist and causes chaos in his wake. Faye eventually reunites with Shitan when the two are held prisoner in a sand cruiser. While Faye sleeps, Shitan speaks to another mysterious masked man called the Emperor. He says that now is the time of the gospel, when those who have been expelled from paradise will return and live there eternally with God. This is the entire Christian cycle of history in a nutshell. Mankind is driven out of paradise in Genesis 3, and in the final chapter of Revelation, returns to an even greater paradise. The one questionable reference he makes is to a group of people called the Gazel, which contextually seems to include both himself and Shitan. In Hebrew, the word Gazel, according to Strong's Biblical Concordance, can refer either to robbery or to a thing taken by violence. The game provides no additional context to what this means right now, but such a reference does create an unsettling aura around Shitan. The scene then shifts to another sand cruiser, populated by sand pirates watching the cruiser Faye and Shitan are being held prisoner. They see Veltal, and say there's no way it can fall into Shakhan's hands. Shakhan, we'll soon learn, is the illegitimate current ruler of Aveh, and his name seems derived from two Asian royal titles, the Persian Shah and the Mongolian Khan. Many of the pirates aboard the ship have referential names as well. I'll start with Franz, the dolphin guy. His name is probably meant to be a reference to Franz Fanon, a psychiatrist and philosopher from Martinique known for his critiques of colonialism. Now, this is interesting. In Japanese, Franz was originally named Vance, and another character, who we'll meet shortly, was named Franz. Richard Honeywood seems to have switched their names for reasons that I'll speculate on later. For now, I'll move on to the fact that he's a dolphin, because that in itself is a reference, this time to the David Brin novel Startide Rising, where the starship Streaker is manned by a number of humanoid dolphins. Gunbuster also features a couple dolphin-esque crew members aboard the Eltrium in a blink and you'll miss it scene in episode 6, but I'm sure Gainax is also referencing Brin's novel as well. As to the other crew members, Jerico, although spelled differently, probably refers to the city in the West Bank, famous for its walls that tumbled down during Joshua's invasion of the Holy Land in the biblical book that bears his name. Maitreya is a Buddhist term referring to a Buddha that's said to appear at the end of the current cycle of history. Marseilles is named after a city in France that gave its name to the French national anthem. The leader of these pirates, who we'll soon find is named Bartholomew, or Bart for short, is named after one of the 12 apostles that, according to tradition, preached the gospel in India. As far as I can tell, these names don't have any meaningful significance attached to them. In an attempt to capture Veltal, Bart attacks the other sand cruiser in his gear, which is named Brigandier. The name Brigandier is derived from two words, brigand, meaning armed robber, and brigadier, which is a military rank. A militant pirate is a descriptor that sums up Bart's character perfectly. Furthermore, as many others have pointed out, the Brigandier's design seems to be derived from the titular robot from Panzerworld Galliant, a 1984 mech series directed by Ryosuke Takahashi. This is a very obscure show, and the mere fact that there's a reference to it in Xenogears says something about how hardcore of a mechotaku Tetsuya Takahashi really is. As a result of the attack, Faye and Bart fall into a cavern beneath the desert, while Shitan manages to stow away aboard Bart's sand cruiser. The attack was essentially a misunderstanding, and Shitan manages to patch things up with the commanding officer, Sigurd, who's apparently an old friend of his. Sigurd is a name derived from Norse myth. It's another name for Siegfried, the hero who killed the dragon Fafnir. The name doesn't seem to have any significance in particular, aside from the fact that a number of figures from Aveh have names derived from the Norse tradition. What, if any, significance this has, I've never been able to figure out. Sigurd, meanwhile, calls Shitan Hyuga, Hyuga being the name of another Imperial battleship. Anyway, getting back to Faye and Bart. After wandering around the cavern, the two discover an eccentric old man named Bal, or Balthazar. Balthazar, along with Gaspar and Melchior, are the names of the three wise men who visited Jesus according to the Gospel of Matthew. Though they are unnamed in the Gospel itself, tradition assigning these three names to those three men is a very ancient one. Aside from the biblical reference, the name Balthazar is probably also a reference to Chrono Trigger, where a figure with that name is one of the three gurus of zeal. Now, it should be noted that in the Japanese version of Chrono Trigger, the gurus are not named after the wise men. However, because Xenogears developers worked with the English localization team, that localization team could have suggested the English names. Balthazar shows Faye and Bart his collection of fossils, and the fact that the fossil record seems to suggest that humans don't appear to have existed on this planet prior to 10,000 years ago. Bart responds by saying that this runs completely counter to the theory of evolution that the ethos teaches. Of course, this is the exact opposite of real life, where fundamentalist churches insist that human beings have only existed for a few thousand years because that's what the Bible suggests. This reference seems to be there just because of how goofy it would sound to anyone in the real world, but it could also suggest that the ethos has an interest in keeping the 10,000-year history of mankind a secret. For his part, Bal says he's always believed in the old myths, and shares one that he knows. Humans once lived in a paradise above the sky, but then they ate the forbidden fruit and God drove them out. Using their new wisdom, humans made giants and declared war on God. God destroys them, but in the process, he was wounded and retreated with paradise under the ocean. Just before this retreat, God creates another batch of humans, who are the ancestors of those living today. This story is a mishmash of several real-life myths. There's the expulsion from paradise, derived from Genesis 3, as we've seen already. The creation of the giants and their subsequent war with God seems to be derived from two sources. Genesis chapter 6, which talks of there being giants on earth before the flood whom God condemned as wicked, as well as the Greek tradition of the Titanomachy and the Gigantomachy, two wars the Olympian gods waged against the Titans and the giants. The repopulation of the earth after the war seems also derived from a Greek story. After Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, the heroes of the Greek flood myth, survive the deluge, they're told by an oracle to throw stones behind them, and these stones transformed into the ancestors of modern humans. We hear one more legend before exiting the cavern, a legend of a gear that has the power of 1,000 regular gears, the Omnigear. In Japanese, the Omnigear is instead called Gear Bara, Bara being a Hebrew word meaning create. It's this word, bara, that's used to describe God's creation of the world in the first chapter of Genesis, a good name for something that's also called the God Gear. The English name Omnigear was likely chosen because it sounds less awkward to an English speaker, but to be fair, it's also a decent substitution for Gear Bara. Omni is a Latin prefix meaning all. The prefix is a component to the words omniscient and omnipotent, all-powerful and all-knowing, two common characteristics of the Judeo-Christian God. Anyway, the two escape the cavern and come out near Bledavik, the royal capital and seat of the Fatima dynasty. Fatima, the name of Aveh's royal family, comes from a traditionally female Arabic name that can mean either one who abstains or one who shines. The Prophet Muhammad's favorite daughter was named Fatima, for instance. I'm assuming Fatima has no greater thematic significance aside from an Arabic name being appropriate for a dynasty of a desert kingdom. Likewise, I'm certain Bledavik has no thematic significance either, as it's an adaptation of another Norse name, Bredablik, probably fucking destroyed that pronunciation, which is the home of the god Balder. The two of them reconvene on Bart's sand cruiser, where Faye meets the crew and learns more about what's going on. We learn the cruiser itself is named the Yggdrasil, the name of the world tree in Norse tradition. We also meet the ship's butler, Maison, whose name is French for house. Once introductions have concluded, everyone is brought up to speed. Bart is actually the legitimate heir to the throne of Aveh, who's working from behind the scenes thanks to Shakhan's coup. Their piracy is a mean of tipping the balance of power away from both Shakhan's regime and the Kislev Empire, as they rightly conclude that in this war, neither side should be supported. Their current plan is to rescue Bart's cousin Margie, the Holy Mother of Nisan, who is being held captive by Aveh for half of the Fatima Jasper, said to point the way to Aveh's great treasure. Both Margie and Nisan's names are references. Margie's real name is Marguerite, the name of the first Canadian female to be canonized by the Catholic Church. As for Nisan, it's another month of the Jewish calendar, the first month, roughly corresponding to around March or April. Before they can proceed with the rescue, however, the Yggdrasil is attacked by a Gebler squadron. There's 5 of them, and each is named for a famous scientist. There's Broyer, who's meant to reference Josef Broyer, the mentor of Sigmund Freud. Renk, who's meant to reference Otto Rank, one of Freud's close associates, most famous for writing the myth of the birth of the hero. Helmholz, who's probably meant to suggest Hermann von Helmholtz, a German scientist known for his contributions to the theory of vision. Vance, who, if you remember from earlier, was originally named Franz in Japanese. This would be thematically appropriate since Franz Fanon is a psychiatrist and philosopher. And finally, Stratski, and I have to thank the guys over at Resonant Arc for helping me with this one. They think his name is probably meant to be spelled Stransky, and there are indeed a number of Bulgarian physicists with the surname of Stransky. As you can probably tell, these names don't mean anything more than just being a theme uniting this particular squadron. The Yggdrasil launches their gears to repel the assault. This includes Shakhan, who commandeers one of their spares called Heimdal. As we've come to expect from an Aveh name, Heimdal is another Norse figure, this time the god who's tasked with guarding the Bifrost Bridge and blowing his horn to signal the beginning of Ragnarok. The subsequent scene is set on the interior of a battleship, focusing on 2 of the game's primary antagonists, Ramsus and Miang. I'll start with Ramsus. He seems to be another conglomeration of Gundam echoes, specifically to the characters of Shar Aznable from the original Gundam series and Jared Messa from Zeta Gundam. Ramsus doesn't wear a mask like Shar does, but he borrows a number of other traits: the color of his hair, his high-ranking military position, his charisma, and as we'll see soon enough, his penchant for flashy robots. From Jared, he inherits more of his darker traits. To jump slightly ahead, both characters find themselves in rivalries with the protagonist, a rivalry that, after a number of continuous setbacks, mutates into a psychotic obsession. As for Miang, all I can say about her right now is that her name is not supposed to be spelled M-I-A-N-G. It should instead be spelled M-Y-A-H-H, and therefore probably be pronounced Mia. This is not a simple matter of competing romanizations. Mia is correct. It's significant that it's actually spelled that way. Of course, I can't say anything more about that right now. Also, despite perhaps being hypocritical, I'm going to continue calling her Miang, purely out of habit. Anyway, once the protagonists have infiltrated Aveh, one of the NPCs tells them another ancient myth. The story goes, there was once a race of great ancients who came from a faraway star and created mankind. These ancients ruled as gods, but eventually man gained knowledge and fought back. The gods escaped to the sky to live in a more advanced civilization than was found on Earth. When people on Earth disappear, this is because they've been abducted by those gods. Someday their army will return to Earth, and when they do, the Earth dwellers will be utterly unable to fight back. The most important feature of this myth is the idea that gods came from a faraway star. This idea is ultimately derived from the Gnostic tradition, where the highest form of divinity is so existentially far removed from the physical world, it's not entirely inappropriate to describe it in alien terms. Indeed, the great Gnostic scholar Hans Jonas subtitled his most famous book, The Gnostic Religion, The Message of the Alien God. No surprise, but we're going to be talking about Gnosticism a lot more as we go on. As for the army of God returning to Earth, this is a relatively common trope in Christian eschatology. To borrow just one example from the New Testament book of Jude, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, and all of their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Whoever propagated this myth would seem to have a vested interest in keeping the people of Aveh in their place. While Bart tries to rescue Margie, Faye takes part in a martial arts tournament to keep the higher-ups of Aveh distracted. His last opponent is someone known only as Wiseman. Wiseman refers to, surprise surprise, the biblical wise men, but beyond that, his character traits seem to recall Schwartz Bruder from G Gundam, another masked fighter who seems intent on assisting the protagonist by unconventional means. In the end, our heroes are successful in freeing Margie from her prison. In response, Ramsus prepares to follow them in his gear, the Wyvern. Though he doesn't actually use it, I might as well discuss Wyvern now. Wyvern is a real-life mythical creature, commonly described as a dragon with 2 legs. The design of Ramsus's Wyvern is distinguished by its intense gold color, an obvious reference to the Hyakushiki, the mobile suit used by Shar Aznable throughout Zeta Gundam. With Margie in tow, the Yggdrasil returns to Nisan. There, our heroes meet with a high-ranked member of the Nisan sect named Sister Agnes. Agnes is the name of a saint, who was murdered during the Christian persecutions of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Apparently she was killed because she rejected the advances of a number of suitors in an attempt to remain a virgin. The crew enters the cathedral, where they see the defining symbol of the Nisan sect and one of the defining symbols of Xenogears itself. Two angelic beings, one masculine, one feminine, each with one wing, their hands outstretched, reaching to touch one another. Margie gives an interpretation of what this means according to the tenets of Nisan's teaching. God could have created human beings perfectly, but if they were perfect, they wouldn't help each other, so they each have one wing to make sure they do. This image is meant to suggest Carl Jung's idea of the anima and animus. To be brief, the anima represents the feminine aspects of personality buried in the unconscious of a man, while the animus represents the masculine in women. Integration with these aspects is a vital step in the Jungian process of individuation, or the realization of one's full self. In addition to this, it shouldn't be lost on anyone that this is another Square game that very prominently features one-winged angels. This is not a coincidence. Before Xenogears was going to be its own game, before it was even going to be a Chrono Trigger sequel, it was supposed to be Final Fantasy VII. We learn that the founder of the Nisan sect was a woman named Sophia, which is a name with, to put it mildly, a fair bit of baggage attached to it. Literally, the word Sophia is Greek for wisdom. It's one of the roots of the word philosophy, or love of wisdom. In the biblical tradition, Sophia evolved into an important aspect of God, usually portrayed in feminine terms, such as in the Old Testament book of Proverbs. Sophia is also an important figure in some Gnostic sects, where she is an emanation of God's wisdom that ultimately resulted in the creation of the physical world. There are a number of saints named Sophia, and many cathedrals named after those saints, most importantly the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. The party is taken to the cathedral's most holy place, the Room of Sophia. The Room of Sophia is the Nisan analog to the Jewish Holy of Holies, the innermost location of the tabernacle and later the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. When the Ark of the Covenant was lost, the Holy of Holies stayed empty. Here, the room is mostly empty, with one major exception, the majestic portrait of Sophia herself. The portrait is clearly meant to suggest Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Both are paintings of a beautiful woman, both are unfinished, and both women have a smile whose meaning is debated by those who see it. We see in a brief flashback that the portrait was painted by Lacan, a man who looks bizarrely similar to Faye. Lacan's name is a reference to Jacques Lacan, a French psychoanalyst who introduced ideas of structuralist and post-structuralist linguistics into Sigmund Freud's theories. Obviously, I'm going to have to come back later to discuss the significance of that name.